Right. And we're live.
This episode of CelloChat is brought to you by Carriage House Violins of Johnson String Instrument. Please visit us at www.carriagehouseviolins.com.
Are we on now?
Yes, let me get out of the shared screen. All right, perfect. Now we're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this cello chat with Robert Jesselson and Theodore Buchholz. Want to take it away now?
Hi, my name is Bob Jesselson, and I'm retired Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of South Carolina, where I taught cello for some 40 years. I now live half the year in Toronto in Canada and half in Columbia, South Carolina. Thanks so much for joining us today. First of all, I'd like to thank Cello Bello for this opportunity today. I very much enjoyed doing some previous cello chats, and I want to thank the staff of Cello Bello, and in particular, I want to thank Paul Katz for his great vision in creating this wonderful website and all the special features that go along with it.
Hi, my name is Theodore Buchholz. I'm the cello professor at the University of Arizona. I'd like to thank each of you for tuning into this webinar today. Here's the plan. Our session will focus on scales and arpeggios, not only the importance of practicing them, but also the joy that one can feel in working through these essential elements of music. After talking about the importance of scales, we will look at practicing with drones as a way to enhance your practicing routine. We will explore some of the music theory, the half steps, whole steps, the intervals that exist inside of the left-hand structure. And then we will talk about some of our favorite ways to practice scales. If at any point you have a question, please feel free to enter that into the chat. And also, if you happen to have your cello with you, there may be a few opportunities where you can play along with us. You can see that Bob has shared his screen, and this will be helpful as we go through some of our various scales and arpeggios.
So we all know how important scales and arpeggios are in music, of course. They're the most basic building blocks for Western classical music, as well as jazz and, of course, popular music. Anyone who's serious about improving their playing knows that they need to build a good foundation by working on their scales and arpeggios. Scales are basically the operating system for learning and playing music. They enable us to play the cello well, to be able to learn music quickly, to come up with good fingerings, and to be able to understand fundamental concepts like intonation, shifting, and even vibrato. Scales and arpeggios can help with learning the finger patterns, improving intonation, enhancing coordination, understanding cello geography, strengthening sight reading ability, playing faster and more accurately, and building or rebuilding fundamental cello techniques. I've always emphasized the importance of knowing not just one system of scales and arpeggios, but knowing many different systems. Lots of different fingering systems, different bowings and rhythms, knowing different octaves on the cello, knowing lots of different types of scales, and of course knowing double stops, octaves, thirds, and sixths, etc. Scales are a great way to explore the fundamental technical issues which we face as cellists. Not just the intonation, but the coordination, the bow control, tone production, etc., etc. And of course, knowing all the scales in all the different keys, at least the 12 majors, the 12 harmonic minors, the 12 melodic minors, and the 12 natural minors, and having multiple fingering systems for the different scales is very useful in sight reading and in learning new pieces. The quicker one can recognize a new pattern of notes and figure out the appropriate fingering, the faster is the learning process. For me, just playing the scales and arpeggios is really not just good enough. They should all be solidly memorized, and this should take place deep in our body, our mind, and in our psyche, so they can be pulled out quickly in order to learn new music faster. According to a compendium of scales by Nicholas Slanimsky, there are altogether some 1,300 different types of scales. So does all this sound scary to you?
Well, it isn't really, if things are taken slowly, one step at a time. This is like how a child learns to crawl, then walk, and then run. Or take a look at this cartoon. On the left, you'll see a ladder with equally spaced, gradual, incremental steps. But on the right, the ladder has rungs that are too far. A student climbing the ladder on the right would certainly fall off, and this would be like trying to learn 3-octave scales before a student has really mastered 2-octave scales with fantastic intonation and a great sound quality. Thus, we must work through scales and arpeggios with a logical sequence comprised of bite-sized steps, from 1-octave scales through 2-octave scales, double stops, and on to the many systems out there. And while doing this, memorizing, incorporating this technique into our minds and bodies. Now, there are a lot of great scale books out there, but the truth is there's not a lot of scale books that are comprehensive. They tend to just focus on one level of a cellist development. Bob and I thought that it would be very useful to have all the different scale systems and fingerings in one place.
So Teddy and I wrote a book that encompasses lots of different scale systems, starting with the most fundamental and basic 1 and 2 octave scales and arpeggios, and working up in an organized, logical, and sequential manner to some of the most complicated scales, not only major and minor, but modal scales, octatonic scales, pentatonic scales, and many others that are important for a modern cellist to know. The book has just now been published by Mel Bay as The Cellist's Guide to Scales and Arpeggios. The key to what we're doing in the book is the subtitle. It's a comprehensive, systematic, sequential approach to scales and arpeggios. I don't know if you can read the slide there, but that's the subtitle under the title there. In other words, we go systematically in sequence, starting with some of the basic scale and arpeggio systems and working our way through more and more complicated systems. Along the way, we discuss some technical issues that affect the playing of scales and arpeggios, and we also provide access to technical videos demonstrating various issues. One of the special features are the drones that accompany the book, but more about that later.
On the next slide is the overall syllabus, the sequence that we approach scales in an organized manner. We start with the most basic 1-octave scales, using only first and half extended, then move on to 2-octave simplified arpeggios, then on to the full yard 2-octave scale and arpeggio system, followed by thumb position scales and arpeggios, then 3 and 4 octaves, next scales on 1 strings, which I will talk about later, and then Bob will demonstrate sort of a full marathon version of scales on 1 string. And then after that, there's countless ways to practice scales, chromatic scales, octatonic scales, double stops, you name it, it's out there. This is a lifetime journey. And sure, a beginner should start at the beginning. If one is an intermediate player, they can start in the middle somewhere, yes, but it's important to make sure that one hasn't skipped over any essential concepts from the most rudimentary phases, just to make sure there's no holes in one's understanding of this fundamental technique. Scales are not just technique, though. Throughout this process, it's incredibly important to remember scales can be a joy to practice. These are a wonderful opportunity to explore musicality and creativity, and that might simply mean practicing scales with dynamics or phrasings. Or that might be something like composing your own unique scale system, exercising your creativity that way to find a way to address some of the technical issues that you're exploring. And in fact, many of the systems that we're going to discuss today are Bob and my own creations. Thus, today we're going to explore a couple of the ideas that we find meaningful for practicing scales, and these are addressed in our book. If you are interested in our book, you can visit Cello Bello's online retail shop, and I believe the web address is visible on the PowerPoint slide there. So now we're going to move on to one of the special features of our book, which is practicing scales with drones.
So a drone is not some sort of unmanned vehicle, and it's not some sort of male wasp or bee. A drone in our usage is a sustained pitch that provides a foundation for a melody, or in this case, a scale or arpeggio. It's useful to practice with drones in order to hear the interval between the sustained note and each degree of the scale that we play. In our book, we provide sustained tonic drones that go on for about 10 minutes or so, and you can do major and minor scales and various arpeggios, or even improvise a melody over the drone. Our drone audio was created using samples of real string instruments to offer a symphonic type of a sound. It includes natural resonance and a small amount of vibrato to help beautify the sound. My former student Ryan Knott created all of the drones, and he did a great job with this. So we also provide chordal drones for every key and for all the different scale systems, the 1, 2, 3, and 4 octave scales and arpeggios, as well as also rhythms for working on spiccato and sautillier with the scales, and even a jazz version in every key. The drones in the book are all accessed by QR codes or links, which take you directly to the drones in each of the different keys. We also have links to about 36 different instructional videos that demonstrate the various techniques and show how to practice the different scales. So here's a sample of an instructional video about the drones, with Teddy demonstrating some of the drones in the 2-octave scale system. The examples in this video are cut short to save time today in this Cello Bello session, but it gives you at least an idea of how you might be working with the drones.
This video is a demonstration of using the drones with the pre-Filiard 2-octave scales and arpeggios. We'll start with a sustained tonic drone. Use this to get acclimated to the key signature. You can play the scale in any tempo that you like, and you can also focus on certain notes that you'd like to tune. Uses 1 note per bow, and then after that we'll have 2 notes in a bow and then 4 notes in a bow. The string strokes, starting with duplets, then triplets, then 16th notes. Next is a jazz accompaniment to the scale. Next is the major arpeggio. That was just an abbreviated example of the possibilities of using drones. As Bob said, we created drone videos for every key signature, scales of 1 octave, 2 octaves, thumb positions, 3, 4 octave scales. And this is not just to enhance perhaps intonation, but really this is about enhancing the learning experiencing, have a richer symphonic listening experience. Now, we received a question in the chat, and that was, is it advisable to use headphones when practicing with a drone or an accompaniment? Yes. You'll want to find the ideal setup, whether that be ideally high fidelity speakers, and then you can play your cello, fully hearing your cello as well as the speakers playing, or putting on headphones so you get enough balance of the recorded drone while listening also to your cello. There's no right or wrong way to do this, and each person will probably just want to experiment for what is the most meaningful to them. We're going to move on, and Bob's going to talk about the universal scale system and a useful tool for understanding how our scale fingering fits on the cello, what we call the Mary system.
So you may have already noticed in your own cello playing that one of the principles of cello fingering is that we can play 3 diatonic notes in one hand position in neck position. And that's less than violinists who can play 4 diatonic notes, but it's more than bassists who can only play 2 notes in neck position. As a result of that, we can play scales with what we call the universal system. In other words, we can play scales in all the keys with the same fingering. For example, you'll notice that I can play all the 2 octave scales with this 3-finger grouping. D major, E flat, E, F, and so forth and so on. So when you break this down further, you'll notice that the major scale is based on 3 patterns of whole and half steps. We call these patterns Marys because we can see them in the little melody, Mary Had a Little Lamb. So here's the basic melody. You can be playing it with me if you want, if you have your cello out. It's in half extended position in this version there. As you play it, try to use the bow distribution that's under the notes there. So LH is lower half, and WB is whole bow, and UH is upper half. It would be again all the way out, all the way back, all the way out. But the point is that this is a grouping of 3 notes there that are a whole step and a whole step from the bottom up, B flat to C, and then C to D. Next, we can play the Mary tune with a whole step from the bottom up and then a half step. That would be in first position. And you can play it with me again. Try using that bow distribution. And we call that a minor Mary because a minor scale would begin that way, whole step and a half. Next, we have the Mary tune with a, next slide. Next, we have the Mary tune, oh, you're not going. There we go. With a C natural, so we get a half step from the bottom up and then a whole step. This a modal Mary or a Phrygian Mary because a Phrygian modal scale begins that way. In that way. So it's a half step and then a whole step. And another one that's very common is the 2 half steps. Because a chromatic scale is made up of half steps. So to summarize, these are all the combinations of whole and half steps, really just 4 combinations. There are actually a few others that use other intervals such as augmented second and so forth, but that's not so important at this point for the major scales. That could be used in the minor scales. So how can we use this information? Well, one of the most important fingering systems for scales, as we mentioned before, is this universal system. In this system, we can play all the major scales with the same fingering, and that's obviously very useful. All of our major scales use the formula major, major, modal, modal, minor. So, for example, a D scale again would be major, major, modal, modal, and minor, or an F scale, major, major, modal, modal, minor. And so all the major scales have that same pattern. And we can do the same, of course, with minor scales, knowing the formula for the minor scales and applying it to the fingerings for all of the scales with 1, 2, 4 or 1, 3, 4. This information about the Marys, by the way, can be very useful in etudes and in our repertoire and sight reading and so forth, working on intonation, understanding the whole and half steps. For example, in the Do Pour etude number 11, you can see that the fingerings group together again in groups of 3 notes all through this. Etc. So you can be playing, let's say, modal Mary, that part, a major Mary, modal Mary, minor Mary, and so forth and so on through the whole thing. Each one of those working on then for intonation, separating it out and working on the whole and half steps and really listening carefully for that. Even the part that goes across the strings can be analyzed with the same Marys if you put all the fingers on the same string. So you have D string and A string, but you put the A string note over on the D string and you go, and you have a modal Mary. On that one you have a minor Mary. Next one, 2 whole steps across the string. If you put it on the same string, you have a major Mary, and so forth, going all the way through that passage. This etude, for example, is a really good example of being able to work on the Marys in that way. And it can be very useful to work on intonation, really stopping and hearing each of the Marys. So next, Teddy is going to talk about scales in thumb position.
I love how the Marys take not only our aural memory, how we hear and remember sounds like Mary Had a Little Lamb, and apply it to our left hand, but it also helps us with chunking information. 3 notes are then only 1 bit of information, and that really helps cello playing. Hang on to that for a brief moment, because when we look at thumb position tetrachords, we're going to add a note to make a tetrachord, but we're going to keep that same idea of half step, whole step. What is the interval set up in the hand position? Now, before we discuss that, let's talk about just setting up thumb position. The picture on the left is a bird's eye view, cellist eye view of the thumb resting on the D and the A string. And you'll notice on the D string, the thumb intersects the string about halfway through the thumbnail. Now on the A string, the thumb intersects the string just before the big knuckle. And every hand is different. The length of a thumb tip will be different for each person, but in general, that's kind of the guidelines for how to set up the thumb position. Or take a look at the side view, the right side picture. And what you'll see we're showing is that the thumb has both an innie and an outie joint. What we mean by this, like an innie belly button. The joint in the middle of the thumb is an innie. It's concave, it's curved in. And then the knuckle where the thumb meets the hand is an outie. It's convex, it sits proudly. So in the thumb shape, we have both an innie and an outie. And then it's important to keep that C shape in the bridge of the hand so as to not let the hand collapse. We would lose a lot of dexterity and strength if the hand were to collapse. Next, we're going to move forward and talk about tetrachords. Now, a tetrachord is a group of 4 notes. They don't have to be played simultaneously. 4-note collection. And there are lots of different tetrachords. Many, including all the Greek scales are comprised of some part of a tetrachord. But we'll talk about the most basic ones today, and I'll quickly demonstrate a couple of them before we break them down and really take a look at it. A major tetrachord, 4 notes, is comprised of a whole step, and a half step. And we're very used to that as the base start of a major scale. A minor tetrachord is a whole step, half step, whole step. And again, we're pretty used to that as a minor scale. Whole step, half step, whole step. The modal, or what we've been calling the Phrygian, is comprised of a half step between the thumb and the 1, whole step between 1 and 2, and a whole step between 2 and 3. And that might sound a little different to our ears, but that's the modal or the Phrygian tetrachord, and we see that all over the repertoire. I'll do one more, which is the harmonic minor, and I'll do this one because it appears, as you guessed, in the harmonic minor scale. That would be a G harmonic minor scale, where we would get a half step between thumb and 1, and then an augmented second, a whole step plus a half step between 1 and 2, and then a half step between 2 and 3. Let's break that down in the next slide, and we'll do a side view of the major tetrachord. If you have your cello with you, you can place your fingers on the cello. I'm putting the thumb on the D harmonic on the D string and the A harmonic on the A string, what we might think of as home base for thumb position. And again, in the major tetrachord, feel free to play along with me. I'm first going to play the thumb to the index finger, which is a whole step. Between the index finger and the second finger, a whole step. Between the second finger and the third finger, a half step. And I suspect that's very intuitive to many of you, but we like to really understand the music theory behind how the hand is set up. Or let's move on to the minor one. Again, between thumb and the index finger is a whole step. Between the index and the second finger is a half step. And then finally, between the second finger and the third finger is a whole step. Let's move on to 2 more tetrachords. In the next slide, you see the Phrygian tetrachord. On the D string, the thumb is on the harmonic D. The index finger will be on E flat. That's a half step between thumb and 1. Let's play those. Between the index and the second finger is a whole step. And then finally, between the second and the third finger is a whole step. That is the Phrygian tetrachord. And now let's finally break down the harmonic minor. Now what you're going to notice, there's a big stretch between first and second fingers, an augmented second. That's 3 half steps. It's important to not strain your hand when stretching, and you can actually release your index finger when you're playing the second finger so as to not hold any unnecessary tension. Here we go, D harmonic thumb. Index finger is a half step away, E flat. Augmented second from index finger to the second finger, E flat to F sharp. And then finally, F sharp to G, second finger to third finger will be a half step. We'll move on to the D major scale. I wish we had time to break down all of these scales, including the Greek ones. That can be a lot of fun to analyze what tetrachords are on which string. But we're just going to start with the D major as an entry point. What I want to mention is that a D major scale is what we call a symmetrical scale. The tetrachord on the D string will be replicated on the A string. A simpler way of saying that is on the D string we'll have a major tetrachord, and on the A string we will also have that major tetrachord. If you'd like to play, I'll go a little slower. We're going to put all of that together, a D major thumb position scale. And again, I know this is familiar to many of you, but let's process those 2 chunks. two chunks of 4 notes in each chunk, a major tetrachord and then a major tetrachord. Of course, you would descend the scale, but our time is limited, so we won't do that. Let's quickly look at our thumb position scale sequence. You see the first scale is a major scale, which we just played. Next is that harmonic minor, which I will very briefly demonstrate. A minor tetrachord, and then that harmonic minor with the augmented second between 1 and 2. And then, of course, you come back down this scale. Then we have a melodic minor, which is an interesting combination of a minor tetrachord with a major tetrachord on the A string. But then it changes on the way down. I will play the descending version. A Phrygian or modal tetrachord with the thumb and the index finger only a half step away. And then a minor tetrachord on the D string. I won't do the natural minor because it's, in fact, the scale that I just played, descending the melodic minor. You also see our arpeggios there, and I wish we had time for that, but we must now move on to chromatic scales.
Okay, great. And I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint at this point. Teddy, did that work?
Yes.
Okay, because we won't be using the PowerPoint anymore. But we did want to talk about the chromatic scales a little bit, because besides our major and minor scales, it's important to do lots of other different kinds of scale systems, as we mentioned before. And one of the most important systems is the chromatic scale, which comes up in lots of pieces, like Saint-Saëns concerto, or in the Popper Hungarian Rhapsody, the big cadenza there. So chromatic scales, of course, are scales all in half steps. The word chromatic comes from the Greek, from the word chroma, meaning color. And a good way to practice this is to do a 2-octave scale on one string using 3 fingers, maybe the metronome around 36 or so. And I would do 2 notes in a bow, 3 notes to a bow, 4 notes in a bow, 6 notes in a bow, and 12 notes in a bow. So for example, on the top octave, or actually do them on all the strings, using a 3-finger system, and so forth. C string, getting acquainted with all of that. And then the top octave, same idea. So forth and so on, up through 12, and then on all of the strings, so that one gets familiar also with the C string going high up on like that. And then one can do a chromatic scale of the whole cello, and so forth. Important to practice in starting on different notes and in different parts of the cello, getting the sound of the chromatic scale in tune, probably using sort of equal temperament rather than expressive intonation for this, and just analyzing and understanding the sound of half steps. So next, Teddy is going to talk about major scales on one string.
Yeah, and I love practicing chromatic scales. For one reason, they're just different, and they allow us to hear intervals differently. We also encourage one to practice whole tone scales or octatonic scales or even quarter tone scales. That'll really clean one's clock on intonation. Let's take a look at scales on one string. And Bob and I really encourage cellists to practice scales 2 octaves or even 1 octave to start with, and then add a second octave up 1 string. And the reason for this is, well, it's challenging, of course, but we see this so much in the repertoire. I'm going to break down a famous passage from the first page of the Elgar Concerto. And I'm going to tell you, we're going to use a 3-finger system. What that means, applied to the Elgar Concerto scale at the end of the first page, we're going to play 3 notes and then shift. Play 3 notes and then shift. I'll play 3 notes, B, C, D sharp. I'll shift. I'll shift. I'll shift. I'll shift. I'll shift. So that's a 3-finger scale, and I'm sure many of you recognize that famous passage at the end of the first page of the Elgar Concerto. Now, there's many different ways to finger that, and a cellist probably wants to go through all the different options to determine not only what's most comfortable for them, but also what's the most expressive, whether they want a glissando up to the top note or something else somewhere in the middle. And so we encourage practicing scales on 1 string, using a variety of fingerings, in fact, all the possible combinations, because when it comes to a piece like Elgar, you're competing against an orchestra, and it's a very impassioned moment. The stakes are high, as well as your energy is probably high. These scales need to be incredibly fluent in your hand. No better place to do that than when practicing scales. So let's take a look. We're going to do a B major scale, B, boy, major scale. And we're going to start with the 2-finger system. And again, what that means is we'll play 2 notes and then shift. 2 notes and then shift. Or in B major, a B and a C sharp, and then shift to D sharp and play the E. Shift to F sharp, play the G sharp. Shift to A sharp and then play the B after that. Shift to C sharp and then the D sharp. And then play the E and the F sharp. Shift and play the G sharp and the A sharp. And then finally, you can put a 3rd finger on the top note, the B. That's a 2-finger system where you play 2 notes and then shift. But let's now, and if you have your cello, I welcome you to join me. Let's do that 3-finger system that I applied to the Elgar scale. We're going to play a B major scale. We will play 3 notes and then shift. B, C sharp, D sharp. We'll shift to E natural, and then we'll play F sharp and G sharp. We'll shift to A sharp, and then we'll play the B and the C sharp. Then we'll shift to D sharp, and then we'll play the E and the F sharp. Then we'll shift to G sharp, we'll play the G sharp, the A sharp, and the B. So that's our 3-finger system, and a cellist will want to be fluent in both of those. But it's also incredibly important to mix and match, and I'll just briefly demo a fingering that probably many of you are incredibly familiar with, but I hope when I show this, it kind of gives you a new framework to think about these scales. I'm going to play a 1-2-4, 1-2, 1-2, 3, 1-2, 1-2, 1-2, 3 scale, and many of you will probably recognize 1-2, 1-2, 1-2, 3. That's a pattern that I bet has been drilled into your scale head. B major, 1-2, 4. I'll shift to 1-2. I'll shift to 1-2, 3. And then the final octave is 1-2, 1-2, 1-2, 3. And of course, that is probably a very familiar fingering to many folks in the room. But I hope that this is a new way of looking at it as a combination of 3-finger systems with some 2-finger systems. Now, Bob's going to put this on steroids and show us his around and around scales using an incredible variety of bowings and rhythms.
Yeah, the around and around system is a system I created to work on speed, playing the scales up and down the fingerboard faster and faster. It's an excellent coordination exercise, changing the number of notes in a bow and coordinating the bow changes, the shifts, the groupings, and impulses, as well as it's a really good concentration exercise. So for this scale, we play a 2-octave scale on 1 string using the 3-finger system that Teddy was talking about. And we'll play 2 notes to a bow, 3 notes to a bow, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 12, and 16 notes to a bow. And the idea is to keep the pulse similar for the entire exercise. So the speed of the notes in the scale will increase as we add the number of notes per measure. And the idea is to play each scale around and around until you reach the tonic. In this case, I'll do a B scale on a new down bow. and then go on to the next groupings of notes per bow. So you set the metronome probably around 40 per measure, repeating the scale over and over with 2 notes to a bow, then 3 notes to a bow, up to 16 notes to a bow. It sounds more complicated probably than it really is. So basically you go up and down as many times as you need to get to a down bow on the tonic. And that means when you do 2 notes in a bow, you go around just once. 3 notes to a bow, you'll go around probably 3 times. 4 notes to a bow, 2 times, etc., etc., etc. The 7 notes to a bow just is 1 time. 16 notes is 8 times around. So I'll just start at the beginning of this and give you an idea how that might work. So 2 notes to a bow. So forth and so on. I'm not going to take the time to do all of them. I might try the 16 notes to a bow still. The 7 is interesting because it only goes around once, of course, because of the octave. But this is 16 notes to a bow. And so the idea intonation-wise is that, as you probably heard, if there was a little bit of an issue going up or down, coming one note or another, I try to fix it on the next time around, making a mental note, because that's the reality of playing when we play a real piece, that we need to adjust. We're not going to get it always perfect every time, but then you adjust the intonation. And so it also builds endurance by playing through this entire system, which takes maybe 6 or 7 minutes without stopping, and gradually increasing the speed of the scales as you increase the number of notes. And it also is great for enhancing concentration and relaxation while you're playing. So next, Teddy is going to talk about another way to build speed into your scales with velocity scales.
And bravo, Bob. That is a virtuosic tour de force to play those. Those are really hard technically and, like you said, mentally. But I love what you just
to get it better in tune.
Yeah, lifelong process, like Casal said. The thing you just said, I think, is so true. We often play, scales, and we might just play a D major scale, and each note gets kind of one chance to be adjusted or fixed, or maybe it was in tune, and so that's great. Or maybe you go around the scale again and you work on the intonation that way. But I love these around and around scales because you get multiple chances to fix a note. I want to talk about a scale system I developed called velocity scales, which give you many chances to fix or address the either intonation or the balance or the sound quality of each of the notes. But I'm going to start with the following. We practice scales often note to note, one note, then the next note, the next note. But most music doesn't exist like that with scales in strict order. Scales leap, jump, arpeggios are in them, they repeat notes. Or I'll put it this way. Think of the Haydn C major concerto, which is probably one of the most scalar concertos we can think of, especially the third movement, fast movement. But think about the first movement, how it starts. There are scales in here, but he noodles around a position. We get multiple notes and multiple iterations of the same notes. And that's how music is often written. So I developed this velocity scale system, and I'm going to play you what I call the final version before we break it down. And if you have your cello, I'll invite for you to join me in the breaking down of it. But first, here's the final version of it. Etc., all the way up the highest register of the cello, 3-4 octaves, whatever you can do. So that's the final version of it. But let's break that down. And we're going to start with a one-finger scale. What that means is we're going to play a D major scale, and we are only going to use the index finger, including no open strings. So we're going to use the index finger for every single note. Here's a D natural, E natural, F sharp, G, A, B natural, C sharp, D. And we could practice that again. One finger scales are actually great for really thinking about intonation as well as shifts. But in the mindset of velocity scales, let's take the next step, which is we're going to do a fast two-note impulse. Let me show you what I mean before we do it together. Etc., etc. So I'll invite you, if you have your cello, you can join me. We're going to play D to E, quickly feeling the hand weight, execute that E natural with a gentle but swift motion. D to E, E to F sharp, F sharp to G, G to A to B, B to C sharp, C sharp to D. We're now going to add a third note, and I'm going to relate this back to what Bob was talking about with Mary's. Mary had a little lambs. We're going to have a D and an E and an F sharp. That's an extended first position. That's a major Mary. We will play 3 notes quickly. We're going to shift to E. We have an E, an F sharp, and a G. That is a minor Mary. We're going to shift to F sharp. We have F sharp, G natural, A natural. That's a modal Mary. We're going to shift to G, A, B natural. That is a major Mary, extended. We're going to shift to A natural. We have a B and a C sharp. That's a major Mary, an extended position. Shift to B, B natural, C sharp, D. That's a minor Mary. Shift to C sharp, D natural with the second finger, E with the fourth finger. That's a modal Mary. And then finally return to D, E, F sharp. That's a major Mary, an extended position. I'll give you one more step and then we must move on, which is that then you can play those 3 notes but also come back down, so it's a quintuplet. Let me show you. That's a 5-note pattern, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're going to work through those positions with that 5-note pattern. Ready, and shift to E, shift to G, shift to A, shift to B, shift to C sharp, shift to D. and so on and so forth. I think at this point you could start to see how maybe you would start to add more groups so that you ultimately get to 4 beats filled with quintuplets for each hand position. This can be applied to any key signature, any register of the cello.
That's great. Well, it's about 2:52, I think, and we could take some questions. I see we answered one already. Hi, Lisa in Germany. And there's a question. Let's see. Can you recommend a comprehensive scale book that includes all finger variations? Well, we think our book is pretty comprehensive because it takes people from the beginning all the way up. But one of the chapters towards the end of the book actually has lots and lots of references to other scale books. There's some fantastic scale books. We can't include everything, of course. I would personally recommend, for example, the Krastev scale. If people can get a hold of that, that was published in England some years ago, and I don't know how available it is anymore. But he's a Bulgarian cellist, and he has lots of interesting, the whole system together for for all the different keys. Richard Aaron has a fantastic set of, well, it's a book. I think it's not available publicly, but I think if you contact him, he's very generous about sharing, but it is a fantastic way of looking at scales. There are a number. We have a whole chapter on different books with different scale fingerings.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I think in our book, we are pretty proud of the scales on one string, which really do exhaustively look through so many of the possible fingering combinations, including even just 1 1 1 1 1 1 1,
Oh yeah,
one finger scale. But
that's a great way to practice.
like Bob was saying, there's a lot of resources out there that maybe don't provide all of the fingerings, but if you take the whole bibliography together, one can really explore a lot of different thought processes out there on how to get around the cello. Just thinking about what's a book that really throws a lot of variety, and not just in terms of fingering, but also rhythms and bowings. Well, I'm gonna have to say that the Yampolsky scale book is a pretty neat resource for an incredible variety of fingerings as well as rhythms and bowings. No key signature is the same as the previous one, so it's really an exploration in variety.
Great. There's another question here. Is there any benefit to trying to play scales as fast as possible? Well, I think like a lot of our learning, we have to start slow and work things carefully, slowly. I think that's like the really most important thing. But yes, there's a benefit in trying to play them fast because we need it often in the literature to play a very fast scale. Almost every piece has various scales and combinations, and often quite fast, especially the more virtuosic things. But even things like, let's say, I don't know, Beethoven Sonata, the A major Sonata, the last movement, it's just a scale in thumb position. It's kind of like what Teddy was working on before, and one has to have the certain flexibility and figure out the relaxation to be able to play a scale in thumb position. Just a D major scale there, but to be able to play that easily in tune and pretty fast. So yeah, I think there's definitely a benefit of playing it, of working fast, but one has to know at what point to do that. And it's like everything else, one starts slowly. And I think these exercises that we're presenting here and then in the book are very useful for trying to break down how to approach practicing these things from slow to fast.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. Yeah, there's a lot of value in it. One has to be careful to not have unnecessary tension or perhaps do damage or play so fast that the ear isn't really hearing accurately how the pitch is coming out. And so I encourage, kind of like my velocity scales, there's a fast motion, but then I sustain a long note. And that's really a nice chance to either relax or to also just make sure, is the note really in tune?
That's great.
Let's look at this next question from Alejandro. The Heinrich Zarzicki book is...
I'm not aware of them.
This is a fascinating book, and if I'm thinking of the right one, I believe maybe a European cellist who actually was teaching in South America. And I love, again, I think I'm right about which one this is. I love this resource. I don't know it to be publicly available. I've only seen a photocopy of it from a student of mine who had grown up in South America. But I believe what's so neat about the Zarzicki book is he gives you a D major scale and more or less works through every fingering possibility of that D major scale, such as like what Bob was doing earlier with the universal fingering. Or let's shift to E. And then let's see what happens to the hands that way. Or let's shift on F sharp. And how does that change the configuration? That's probably not a totally accurate representation of it, but I remember that being the gist of it. And I love that methodical idea of what is every possible combination for a D major scale and how does that change how we get around the cello?
That's great. Let's see, we have another question. Does your book include the solfege, movable do, fixed do, or both? If not, does a book like that exist? Well, that's sort of a little bit out of the purview of our book. Working on, I mean, there are, as we were writing this book, it took us about 2.5 years to write this book, and it started with a pretty simple concept of what we're going to do, and then it just kept growing and getting bigger and bigger, and the drones were added, and the instructional videos were added, and all kinds of stuff. I should say, actually, the inspiration for my part of it, of writing this book, was because of my granddaughter in Toronto, who was starting through the Suzuki system, and I felt like she needed a little bit more structure with how to approach the scales, and so she and I have been working together actually on that, and she's now going to the Royal Conservatory there, the RCM. So anyway, to make a long story short, we weren't able to include a lot of things that we might have wanted to or loved to include in this book. We tried to make it accessible and at the same time be able to be systematic and comprehensive and enable people to be able to go in a systematic way up through that sort of ladder that Teddy was showing before. But as with everything else, there are a lot of resources out there, and some of them are, this would be a good grounding place, and then one expands to a lot of the other kinds of books that are out there. So no, we don't have specifically solfege, although singing is a big part of, I'm sure, Teddy's teaching as well as my teaching. I remember my teacher saying, if you can sing it, you can play it. And I think that's true with hearing the whole steps and the half steps and really understanding how the intervals work and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Singing is a huge part of our learning process, even through scales. And we don't really include solfege, but I'm going to say the following, and I will die on this hill. If we did include solfege, it would be fixed do.
Okay. That's what I had learned, actually, was fixed do in Germany when I studied there. So we're just about out of time. This is actually amazingly perfect timing because we didn't know when we prepared this, how long we would go. We have a couple of other topics that we could have talked about. I would have liked to have talked about octatonic scales, which I think are really important for hearing those half and whole steps, and a lot of literature that uses octatonic scales. And I think Teddy was going to talk about thirds, practicing thirds and fourths, actually. And so we'll have to just do another cello bello session or something.
Part two.
I was trying to get the PowerPoint back on to show where you can get the book again if anybody's interested. You can get it through the Cello Bello shop there. That's the ebook version. For the hard copy version, you can go to our website, thecellistguide.com, I think it is. And then you certainly can contact either Teddy or myself. And we hope that people enjoy using the book and find it beneficial.
Thank you so much for everyone for being here, contributing to our conversation. We value your presence.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye. Thanks, Cello Bello.